event for Europe and the rest of the world. We will pay tribute to those who prevented Nazism from enslaving Europe, and I believe that Russia's attendance is a momentous event. The thing is that Russia and the anti-Hitler coalition countries, including France, were allies in that struggle for freedom. And my country played a vital role, and maybe even the decisive role, in defeating Nazism. But we'll never forget the French resistance fighters and the French soldiers who fought side by side with us on the Soviet-German front, which is also called the Eastern Front. I believe that this should not only remind us about our history, but also help to promote our relations now and in the future.
Justement, vous avez, avec la Russie, votre place sur les plages de Normandie.
Of course, you and Russia will take your rightful place on the beaches of Normandy. You lived in the Soviet Union until you were 40, you saw it collapse, and now you are actively contributing to Russia's revival. What would you like to see happen now? What are your goals? Is Russia's strategy a path of dialogue or expansion and conquest?
Well, a policy of expansionism and conquest has no future in the modern world. We're confident that Russia can and should be a partner with its traditional allies, in the broad sense, now and also in the future. This is what we want, and this is what we will keep working towards. We see no other way to develop relations with our neighbors and all other countries.
Do you want to defend the Russian nation or to become the symbol of Russian nationalism and the Russian Empire? We remember what you said about the Soviet Union's dissolution. You said that it was the worst geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. You also said that those who do not regret the collapse of the Soviet Union have no heart, and those who want to restore it have no brains. You have brains. What do you propose? Russian nationalism or the restoration of the Russian Empire to its previous borders?
We will not promote Russian nationalism, and we do not intend to revive the Russian Empire. What did I mean when I said that the Soviet Union's collapse was one of the largest humanitarian, above all humanitarian, disasters of the 20th century? I meant that all the citizens of the Soviet Union lived in a union state irrespective of their ethnicity. And after its collapse, 25 million Russians suddenly became foreign citizens. It was a huge humanitarian disaster. Not a political or ideological disaster, but purely humanitarian upheaval. Families were divided, people lost their jobs and means of subsistence, and had no means to communicate with each other normally. This was a problem.
And what about the future? Do you want to restore the empire within the former borders, or do you want to continue developing your country within your own borders?
We want to develop our country within our own borders, of course. But, and this is very important, like other countries in other parts of the world, we want to use modern policies to improve our competitive advantage, including economic integration. This is what we're doing in the post-Soviet space, within the Customs Union, and now also within the Eurasian Union.
Mr. Putin will now talk about why a neighboring country, Ukraine, is being torn apart by war. There is no other word for it. Now, pro-Russian forces want to breach Ukraine's borders. Who can stop them, and what is your policy?
I wouldn't call them either pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. They are people who have certain rights, political, humanitarian rights, and they must have a chance to exercise those rights. For example, in Ukraine, governors are still appointed by Kiev. After the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in February, the first thing the new authorities tried to do was deprive those ethnic minorities of the right to use their native language. This caused great concern among the people living in East Ukraine.
You did not let this happen, but are you saying that we are on the verge of another Cold War?
I hope we're not on the verge of any war. Second, I insist that people, wherever they live, have their rights and they must be able to fight for them. That's the point.
Is there any risk of a war? Now, as we see tanks on their way from Kiev, many people in France are asking this question. Were you tempted to send troops to eastern Ukraine?
This is an interview which implies short questions and short answers. But if you have patience and give me a minute, I will tell you how we see it. Here's our position. What actually happened there? There was a conflict, and that conflict arose because the former Ukrainian president refused to sign an association agreement with the EU. Russia had a certain stance on this issue. We believed it was indeed unreasonable to sign that agreement because it would have a grave impact on the economy, including the Russian economy. We have 390 economic agreements with Ukraine, and Ukraine is a member of the free trade zone within the CIS. And we wouldn't be able to continue this economic relationship with Ukraine as a member of the free trade zone. We discussed this with our European partners. Instead of continuing the debates by legitimate and diplomatic means, our European friends and our friends from the United States supported the anti-constitutional coup. This is what happened. We did not cause this crisis to happen. We were against this course of events, but after the anti-constitutional coup, let's face it, after all,
But now we see so much tension in politics. Yet despite this, we will be in Normandy speaking about peace, while Barack Obama keeps urging Europe to arm itself.
well, we must always talk about peace, but we should understand the causes and nature of the crisis. The point is, no one should be brought to power through an armed anti-constitutional coup. And this is especially true of the post-Soviet space, where government institutions are not fully mature. When it happened, some people accepted this regime and were very happy about it, while other people, say in eastern and southern Ukraine, just won't accept it. And it's vital to talk with those people who didn't accept this change of power, instead of sending tanks there, as you said yourself, instead of firing missiles at civilians from the air and bombing non-military targets.
Mais, Monsieur le Président, la Maison-Blanche.
But, Mr. President, the United States and the White House claim they have evidence that Russia intervened in the conflict, sent its troops and supplied weapons. They claim they have proof. Do you believe that?
Proof? Why don't they show it? The entire world remembers the US Secretary of State demonstrating the evidence of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, waving around some test tube with washing powder in the UN Security Council. Eventually, the US troops invaded Iraq. Saddam Hussein was hanged, and it later turned out that there had never been any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You know, it's one thing to say things, and another to actually have evidence. I will tell you again, no Russian troops.
Are you saying the US is lying?
There are no armed forces, no Russian instructors in southeastern Ukraine, and there never were any.
So you do not want to annex Ukraine, and you never tried to destabilize the situation there?
We never did that. The Ukrainian government must now sit down and talk with their own people instead of using weapons, tanks, planes and helicopters. They must start the negotiating process.
The new Ukrainian president was elected on the 25th of May through a democratic vote. Do you recognize Mr. Poroshenko as legitimate president?
I've already told you and will say it again. We will respect the choice of the Ukrainian people and we will cooperate with Ukrainian authorities.
In other words, if you meet him on the 6th of June on the beaches of Normandy, and if President Hollande helps to make this meeting possible, will you shake hands with him? Will you talk with him?
You know, I don't plan to evade anyone. President Hollande kindly invited me as the representative of Russia to attend this commemoration, even though the event it will commemorate was tragic. I was pleased to accept his invitation, and I'm grateful to the President for inviting me. There will be other guests, and I'm not going to avoid any of them. I will talk with all of them.
But will you meet with Poroshenko? You said you would only work with him on the condition that he would not totally yield to US influence.
I didn't say that he shouldn't yield to US influence. He's free to accept any influence he wants. Ukrainians voted for him and he is free to develop a policy. If he chooses to accept anyone's strong influence, let him. But I wouldn't.
La souveraineté de l'Ukraine
Do you recognize Ukraine's sovereignty and its neutral stance with respect to relations between Russia and the West?
Конечно. И мы признаем...
Yes, we recognize its sovereignty. Moreover, we'd like Ukraine to act as a sovereign state. Joining any military bloc or other rigid integration alliance amounts to a partial loss of sovereignty. But if a country opts for this and wants to cede part of its sovereignty, it's free to do so. Regarding Ukraine and military blocs, this is what worries us. Because if Ukraine joins, say, NATO, NATO's infrastructure will move directly towards the Russian border, which cannot leave us indifferent.
Monsieur le Président, vous avez...
Mr. President, Russian troops annexed Crimea recently. Will you ever give it back?
Это заблуждение.
It's a delusion that Russian troops annexed Crimea. Russian troops did nothing of the kind. Frankly,
Не буду
Mais
скрывать.
la Crimée apparaît maintenant sur la
But
carte.
Crimea has been included on the map of Russia, the kind of maps we used in school. It's part of Russia now. What was it? Annexation or reunification? Which word should we use?
Если вы позволите...
if you'll let me finish, I think you'll see what I mean. Russian troops were in Crimea under the international treaty on the deployment of the Russian military base. It's true that Russian troops helped Crimeans hold a referendum on their A, independence, and B, desire to join the Russian Federation. No one can prevent these people from exercising a right that is stipulated in Article 1 of the UN Charter, the right of nations to self-determination.
In other words, you will not return Crimea. Crimea is Russia. Is that it?
Крым в соответствии с волеизъявлением людей, которые живут...
In accordance with the expression of the will of the people who live there, Crimea is part of the Russian Federation and its constituent entity. I want everyone to understand this very clearly. We conducted an exclusively diplomatic and peaceful dialogue. I want to stress this, with our partners in Europe and the United States. In response to our attempts to hold such a dialogue and to negotiate an acceptable solution, they supported the anti-constitutional state coup in Ukraine. And following that, we could not be sure that Ukraine would not become part of the North Atlantic military bloc. In that situation, we could not allow a historical part of the Russian territory, with a predominantly ethnic Russian population, to be incorporated into an international military alliance, especially because Crimeans wanted to be a part of Russia. I'm sorry, but we couldn't act differently.
Le président François Hollande...
So, François Hollande has invited you to France, to Paris and Normandy. You know him very well. Can you move further forward, and can you describe your relations as confidential?
Думаю, да.
Yes, I think so.
Думаю, да. У нас...
Vous croyez, vous êtes sûr?
Do you think so, or are you sure?
Ну, мне до сих пор я так
I've always thought so. I see no reasons to think otherwise. We have very good interstate relations, but we have much yet to do to promote our economic ties. But our personal relations have always been trust-based, which helps in work as well. I hope it will stay this way.
Vous parliez de relations confidentielles.
Talking of trust-based relations, both in defense and the economy, you have paid over €1 billion for 2 Mistral-class amphibious assault ships, and Russian naval officials are to visit Saint-Nazaire in a few days. Have you given them special permission to go to France?
I believe we're living in a civilized world, and we will all continue to fulfill our obligations and contractual commitments. I've heard a lot of talk about these ships going to Russia, and some people believe that Russia shouldn't get them. You know, here in Russia, we had a lot of opposition to this contract. France is entitled to decide against selling the ships, but in that case, we should get our money back. This means that our countries won't have an opportunity to develop ties in the defense sector. But overall, we are ready to expand our cooperation and even place new orders if our French partners are interested.
Vous demandez à la France.
Despite external pressure, you've asked France to supply these assault ships. And if France does, you may place other orders as well, right?
Мы ничего не просим.
We expect our French partners to fulfill their contractual obligations. And if everything goes as we agreed, we will not rule out the possibility of further orders, and not necessarily in naval shipbuilding. They may concern other sectors as well. Overall, our relations in this area are developing well, and we would like to continue strengthening them in aviation, shipbuilding, and other sectors. We have successful cooperation experience in space exploration at the Guyana Space